In 3262 of the Second Age, Sauron was taken to Numenor as a prisoner by King Ar-Pharazon the Golden. At that time, he was considered to be Numenor's greatest enemy, yet barely 3 years later, he became the king's closest advisor. Over the next 54 years, Sauron would corrupt many of the Númenóreans into worshipping Morgoth and practicing vile deeds such as slavery and human sacrifice, ultimately leading to Numenor's destruction. So in this video, we ask the question, how did Sauron corrupt the Númenóreans so quickly? Before we even talk about Sauron, it's important to note that Numenor was already corrupted before Sauron even arrived. Following the War of the Elves and Sauron, Numenor abandoned its isolationism and began to take a much greater interest in Middle-earth. In the past, the Númenóreans had treated the men of Middle-earth with respect, acting as gift-givers and teachers, but starting with Tar-Kiriatan, who took the throne in 1869 of the Second Age, the Númenóreans started to oppress the men of Middle-earth, taking their lands and whatever else they wished from them. Numenor started to become a powerful coastal empire, with all manner of tribute flowing towards the island. This had a follow-on effect. Now that the rulers and people of Numenor were amassing vast amounts of wealth and power, they didn't want to relinquish it at death. Beforehand, Númenóreans had willingly given up their lives before their bodies and minds started to fail, but now they clung onto life for as long as they could. While the fear of death was always present, now the Númenóreans began to openly wonder if death could be avoided. This turned their gaze westward to Valinor, the Undying Lands. The Númenóreans misunderstood the whole concept of the Undying Lands. They were not called that because they gave you eternal life. They were called that because those that lived there did not die. The land was not meant for mortals, but the Númenóreans were not satisfied and believed that the Valar were lying to them. The Númenórean actions against the peoples of Middle-earth, and their growing rejection of the Valar, led to them falling under the shadow. Thus, the gifts that the Númenóreans had been given started to be withdrawn. Their lengthy lifespan started to decrease, and their wisdom began to fade. This, of course, only accelerated the growing enmity between the Númenóreans and the Valar, fully demonstrated when the 20th king of Numenor took the name Ar-Adunakor, Lord of the West, a name which was seen as blasphemous. By the time of Argamilzor, the 23rd king, most of the Númenóreans, known as the King's Men, had completely rejected the Valar. Argamilzor was an awful man. He completely banned the usage of elven languages, banned elves from Numenor, and punished those that secretly welcomed them. He forcibly migrated the faithful, the minority of Númenóreans who were still loyal to the Valar, to the eastern half of Numenor. The White Tree and Armanelos began to die, and rather notably, Argamilzor was the first ruler of Numenor to not ascend the holy mountain of Meneltarma to display reverence to Eru Ilúvatar. This brings us to Ar-Pharazon. He was the grandson of Argamilzor, but through Gamilcad, the younger son, so he was not directly in line to the throne. In his youth, Ar-Pharazon was a captain of great renown, winning plenty of wealth for Numenor and sharing it with the people, earning him a significant amount of popularity and giving him leadership of the King's Men after the relatively early death of his father. Upon the death of Tar-Palantir, Ar-Pharazon infamously usurped the throne, forcing a marriage between himself and his cousin, Miriel, who should have been the ruling queen. Now, despite the enmity between Numenor and the Valar, Ar-Pharazon's primary enemy was in Middle-earth, and that was Sauron. When Ar-Pharazon returned to Numenor following the death of his father, Sauron grew bold, putting forth his own strength and threatening Numenor's cities along the coasts of Middle-earth. But what offended Ar-Pharazon the most was that Sauron dared call himself the King of Men. Ar-Pharazon believed that that title should only be reserved for himself. Thus, he decided to humble Sauron. Amassing a great fleet and army, he landed at Umbar and marched north to challenge Sauron. But Sauron recognized that any attempt to defeat the Númenóreans in the field was in vain. He believed that he couldn't even trust his own servants not to flee at the sight of Númenórean power, so he resolved to deal with the Númenóreans through other methods, through subtlety and guile. You see, on top of Sauron's natural deceptiveness, which he had used to lure Celebrimbor and the Smiths of Eregion, Sauron had another weapon up his sleeve, or on his finger, the One Ring. The One Ring, which could be used to dominate the hearts and minds of those who lacked the strength or knowledge to resist it. So when Sauron came before Ar-Pharazon and humbled himself, he immediately made an impression on many of the Númenóreans who bore witness to the meeting. It's said that everything he said came across as fair and wise. But Ar-Pharazon himself would not be swayed that easily, and untrusting of Sauron, he decided he should be taken back to Numenor as a hostage. Sauron pretended to be upset by this, but secretly, it's what he wanted. If he could not destroy his enemies from the outside, he could at least try and destroy them from within. And as I said at the start of the video, that's exactly what Sauron was able to do. In the space of 3 years, Sauron managed to position himself as Ar-Pharazon's closest advisor. In the Akallabeth, we learn that Sauron was able to do this through his cunning and through the strength of his will, and by constantly flattering Ar-Pharazon, who was extremely prideful. On top of that, Sauron proved himself useful to the Númenóreans. As one of the Maya, he knew things that even the Númenóreans did not know. This created a ripple effect. Seeing how much Ar-Pharazon relied upon Sauron, many of the other powerful figures in the realm who served on Ar-Pharazon's council began to try and win Sauron's favour too. And although the Akallabeth doesn't actually mention the One Ring at this point, Tolkien confirms in these letters that Sauron did have the One Ring with him at this time. Why didn't the Númenóreans take it off him? Well, Sauron was probably cunning enough to convince his captors to let him keep it, but more importantly here, Tolkien tells us that the Númenóreans didn't know anything about the Rings of Power. We're actually told that the elves kept their knowledge of them a secret, so when Sauron was in Numenor, the Númenóreans had no idea that the nondescript gold ring that he carried was actually a weapon of terrible power. But regardless of the power of the One Ring, perhaps Sauron's greatest strength was his ability to exploit the weakness of the Númenóreans, and specifically of Ar-Pharazon. For example, Sauron knew of Ar-Pharazon's endless ambition, so he dangled a carrot in front of Ar-Pharazon's eyes, offering him power unparalleled, but saying that the only way to achieve it was through worship of the darkness, aka the worship of Melkor. And aware of the Númenórean falling out with the Valar, Sauron told Ar-Pharazon that Eru Ilúvatar was just a phantom, a lie, a way for the Valar to enslave men, and stopping them from achieving their destiny. Eventually, Ar-Pharazon fell utterly to Sauron's corruption, at first secretly, and then openly. Although he believed himself to be king of men, lord of Middle-earth, Ar-Pharazon was now wrapped around Sauron's finger. And remember, Ar-Pharazon was extremely popular amongst the king's men, so when the king fell to the shadow, so did the rest of them. But this is where Sauron's malice came into play. He was effectively king of Numenor. He had a powerful empire that he could have used to achieve his ultimate dream, perfect order. But he also wanted revenge for what the Númenóreans had done to him in the past. So he decided to twist Numenor into something completely unrecognizable. This is where the more heinous deeds begin. Sauron was able to construct a massive temple in Armenelos, and the first thing to be consumed in that temple was Nimloth, the White Tree. But that was just the start. In the temple, the followers of Melkor began to practice human sacrifice at Sauron's bidding, so that Melkor might release them from death. Sauron obviously knew this was a load of rubbish, there was no release from death. But for him, it was a convenient way to get rid of potential enemies, as those sacrificed were often from the faithful. Sauron also took advantage of the moral failings of the Númenóreans to have some fun. The Númenóreans, once immune to sickness, blessed with long life, given greater wisdom, now had none of those things. They grew sick and mad in their old age, fearing death as it came to consume them. Men became jealous and cruel, seeking revenge against each other, and slaying each other with little cause. Sauron and his closest servants exacerbated this, travelling the land as agents of chaos, turning man against man, lord against lord. And even as Sauron was acting as Ar-Pharazon's closest advisor, he was also attempting to turn his people against him, for no other reason than to cause destruction. Even in Middle-earth, the Númenóreans somehow became even worse. They had long since stopped coming as gift-givers or teachers, but now they didn't even come as rulers. Instead, they would come as men of war, hunting the native men of Middle-earth, enslaving them, and taking their goods without reason. In the tale of Tal Elmar, we see just how afraid the native men are of the Númenórean ships when they're seen off the coast. In this way, it's said that Ar-Pharazon became the greatest tyrant the world had ever seen since Morgoth himself. And speaking of Ar-Pharazon, this was Sauron's final moment of revenge. He had played on the weaknesses of the Númenóreans' fear of death, and now it was Ar-Pharazon's turn. The king knew that he was nearing the end. He was entering his 190s, and his own father had only reached the age of 199. If he was going to achieve eternal life like Sauron said he could, he was going to have to achieve it soon. And Sauron was only too willing to point him in the right direction. or wrong direction, Valinor. Once again, Sauron repeated the oft-believed lie that Valinor contained the gift of eternal life, and that the Valar were withholding it from the Númenóreans. Ar-Pharazon simply had to go and claim it for himself. Once again, Sauron knew this was all rubbish. Even though the king was firmly under his own thumb, Sauron never forgot being humiliated, so his plan was to send Ar-Pharazon and his army to their deaths, and then he could rule Numenor and Middle-earth without any challenger. But Sauron underestimated the wrath of the Valar and Ilúvatar. Yes, they dealt with Ar-Pharazon and his army just as Sauron expected, but Numenor was not spared, falling into the abyss of the sea, taking everyone and everything with it. Sauron himself was caught in the ruin, and as Tolkien tells us, his bodiless spirit was forced to take the One Ring and flee back to Barad-dûr. Interestingly enough, so great was Sauron's impact on the Númenóreans that the remaining King's Men in Middle-earth still continued to follow him, fighting for him during the War of the Last Alliance, and becoming known as the Black Númenóreans. Evidently, they had no idea that it was actually Sauron behind the destruction of Numenor. Although the Black Númenóreans would fall from power throughout the Third Age, some still existed at the end of the age, such as the Mouth of Sauron, and they still served him. It's crazy when you think about it. Sauron's 57 years in Numenor earned him powerful servants for the next 3,000 years. As I said earlier, Sauron did have the One Ring with him in Numenor, and undoubtedly it played a part in corrupting the Númenóreans. But you have to wonder if Sauron could have achieved the same results without it. Like I said, the One Ring could dominate lesser wills, and although Ar-Pharazon was a mighty man, he was still lesser than Sauron. But I think one must credit the Númenóreans for falling towards the shadow long before Sauron arrived, and one must credit Sauron himself for being able to exploit those weaknesses. The fear of death was a powerful thing, and Sauron knew exactly how to wield it as a weapon, and that very quickly caused the Númenóreans to destroy themselves. Although it bears resemblance to many myths in our own world, I don't think Tolkien really intended for there to be a message about the downfall of Numenor. He did famously hate allegory. But if I think there's one thing you can take away from Numenor's downfall, and how easy it was for Sauron to corrupt it, it's at how dangerous fear can be. The Númenóreans feared death to the point where they ended up letting it control their lives, and that they were willing to do anything to avoid it. Sauron realized this, and he realized that he could get the Númenóreans to destroy themselves. And unfortunately for Sauron, perhaps they destroyed themselves a little too well. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. If you're confused about how Sauron managed to save the One Ring from Numenor's destruction, it's that it seems like his spirit had the power to physically interact with the world at this point. He probably wasn't able to save the One Ring after the War of the Last Alliance because Isildur took it from him while he was actually still alive, and because he was severely weakened after that death. It did take him a long time to regenerate, so to speak. Anyway, cheers, farewell, and remember, Gandalf said you shouldn't have the right to choose who lives or dies, and that's some wise words. But if the Númenóreans just killed Sauron, they would have saved themselves a lot of trouble.